All right. I received this from a reliable source. I was told that Schaeffer Cox wrote these 51 reasons to exonerate Cox from the CMU secret CIA torture prison. It says things like Schaeffer Cox Papers number 1. It goes all the way up to Schaeffer Cox Papers number 51. But rather than repeat that each time, I'll just say number 1, number 2, all the way up through number 51. So here we go. Schaeffer Cox Papers number 1. Suppress, then lie. The government, by motions and hearsay objections, suppressed their own secret recordings of Cox saying he was leaving the country and that he would not participate in violence. The government then turned around and argued to the jury that Cox's testimony of the same was false because he could offer no recordings to corroborate his claims. Number 2, pre- and post-trial are our best record. The record during trial is quite poor compared to what is contained in pretrial motions and sentencing documents. Cox's innocence was pretty well proved before and after trial, but not at trial. Number 3, ex parte representation hearing. At trial, Nelson Traverso, which was Cox's attorney, totally lost it. He got super paranoid and kept telling Cox over and over that Cox needed to move to Peru. Traverso became extremely sweaty and fidgety. Investigator Rolly Port tried to take Traverso to the hospital. Traverso refused to go for medical treatment and also refused to offer any exhibits for Cox's defense. Traverso claimed that if he embarrassed the government, that they would just go after him too. That's not the kind of attitude you want your attorney to have. When Cox was unable to force spastic Traverso to offer essential evidence, Cox called an ex parte representation hearing with the judge. Cox explained that Traverso was trying, but he was too sick to function, and that this was depriving Cox of both his right to counsel and his right to confront the witnesses against him. The judge suggested that Cox have Traverso file a motion to re-examine any witnesses he need to. After this, Cox was unable to reach Traverso by phone or otherwise, and Traverso refused to file a motion to re-examine any witnesses. Investigator Port was livid with Traverso. Cox was in utter shock. Number 4, Dooley to the rescue. Tim Dooley, trial counsel for Cox's co-defendant Coleman Barney, knew Cox was innocent. Rolly Port was investigator for both Cox and Barney, so Dooley had access to the exhibits that needed to be introduced to prove Cox innocent. Cox called Dooley and asked him to represent Cox's defense as Traverso would not and was MIA, missing in action. Dooley agreed and offered the requested evidence, which the court rejected after the government's hearsay objection. The evidence, however, fell squarely under the state of mind exception and should have been admitted. Number 5, identical cases. Barney and Cox had identical cases, identical evidence, and the same investigator. Dooley presented the tapes showing Barney rejected the informant's proposal, and he was acquitted. Traverso refused to present the tapes where Cox rejected the informant's proposals, and Cox was wrongly convicted. Number 6, hostage witnesses. When the government filed the charges in a district other than the one where the crime was alleged to have occurred, it amounted to a change of venue without a hearing. When the judge refused to move the trial to the correct venue, Cox could not afford to fly all of his witnesses to Anchorage and put them up in hotels. Traverso told Cox that he wasn't going to call any out-of-town witnesses until Cox paid Traverso in full, because Cox didn't have the money to pay Traverso and pay for travel and lodging for witnesses. Number 7, no stamp needed. In 2009, Cox went to the local ATF office in Fairbanks to ask if he needed to get the $200 tax stamp on an antique replica machine gun he made himself. The ATF agent told Cox and his friends, Roberts, Sigma, Clark, and Anderson, that you only needed the tax stamp if the firearm crossed state lines or changed hands. The agent gave the example that a Springfield .45 manufactured in Springfield, Massachusetts, that never left Massachusetts, had not entered into federal jurisdiction. This sounded logical, and Cox did not seek a tax stamp for his homemade firearm. Number 8, flip-flop on stamps. The fact that the ATF had told Cox wrongly, according to the AUSA, that he did not need a tax stamp was raised in pretrial motion as an entrapment by estoppel defense. The judge denied this motion, citing that it was an issue for the jury. But then at trial, the judge granted the government's motion for protective order barring presentation of that defense to the jury. See docket number 351. Number 9, deaf judge. The judge is almost completely deaf and is totally deaf without his special hearing equipment. As a result, he was confused much of the time. When he would get confused, he would ask the prosecution what he should do. Then he'd just do that. He may be a bit senile too. Yeah, very interesting. Number 10, Strong Frank's motion. Dooley and Port put together a very good motion for Frank's hearing that refuted with recorded evidence nearly every single line, and certainly every material line, of the FBI's affidavit in support of warrants. The hearing was granted, but the motions were denied without making any specific finding. The judge just said, "I'm going to leave that to the Ninth Circuit." Number 11, 20% of discovery. All of the pretrial motions would have been way stronger, and the government wouldn't have been able to lie to the judge like they did at oral argument if the defense had had the discovery they have now back then. At the time, the defense had less than 20% of what they do now. Number 12, threatening witnesses. The FBI threatened the MPs to try to keep them from testifying for the defense. This was investigated and documented by Rowley Port. One testified, 2 did not. Number 13, fugitive. It was highly prejudicial for AUSA Scrocky to keep yelling fugitive and pointing at Cox, when the truth is, Cox wasn't a fugitive. He was running from C.I. Fulton and Bennett, who told him they were going to kill him because he would not plot a crime with them. Emails between FBI and AUSA Scrocky show that they knew Cox was in fear for his life and leaving the country because of it, yet they adamantly claimed the opposite to judge and jury. Number 14, state of mind. State of mind evidence was everything in this case. The narrative of actual events was more or less, CIs try to bully Cox into plotting a crime, Cox gets scared and runs away. FBI follows and arrests. This isn't a very good case for a conspiracy to murder, so the government shifted everything into prejudicial speculation about what's in Cox's mind and what he might do in the future when he's strong enough, while at the same time suppressing all evidence of what was actually in his mind, what he actually did do, and his actions to avoid conflict at all costs and be like Gandhi, not Rambo. Number 15, right to refuse. By international standards, the way the American police set people up is bad enough, as is. But this case brings into question whether or not people being set up even have the right to refuse. The more Cox refused the violent proposals of the government, the harder they pushed until they were using actual physical violence with a weapon, death threats on him and his family, do-or-die ultimatums, and physical restraint to prevent him from getting away from the informants. This is not law enforcement, it's cartel violence with a badge. Number 16, Traverso claims. Nelson Traverso never reviewed the discovery. He claims he was too busy to negotiate a plea deal on the smaller charges, that he forgot the case file when he drove down to the Anchorage for trial, that this was his first federal trial ever, that he disappeared for 20 days right after the verdict because he was tired, that Cox was not allowed to switch attorneys after pretrial motions had been ruled on. That redacted. Number 17, government misconduct may be irrelevant. All of the government's misconduct is harmless error that won't even need to be addressed if Cox can just play the recordings that show he had no criminal intent or willingness to harm others except to lawfully defend his or his family's lives, and that he was leaving the country precisely to avoid being put even in that type of situation. Number 18, credibility contest. Cox testified truthfully at trial, but when Traverso would not present corroborative evidence and the government objected to the evidence presented by Dooley, the question became primarily one of credibility between Cox and AUSA's rhetoric. The judge should have allowed the recording to be played rather than forcing the jury to choose who to believe about what was said. Schaeffer Cox, papers number 19. No case, no deal. This was Cox's first rodeo with the federal system. He did not know what a good attorney looked like or what to expect. Had he known then what he knows now, Cox would have accepted a plea deal on one or two of the minor weapons charges, which is what the government tried to get him to do. This would have avoided the conspiracy and solicitation to murder counts altogether. When Cox asked Traverso to calculate the sentencing guidelines on the weapons charges the government wanted him to plead to, compared to the conspiracy to murder charges they were threatening if he rejected the plea deal, Traverso claimed he was too busy to look into the guidelines. Final sentence redacted. Having no starting point of potential sentencing exposure and having little or no contact with Traverso, Cox never negotiated a deal with the AUSAs. This had the mutually disastrous effect of calling the government's bluff on the conspiracy and solicitation to murder charges they had threatened to bring. The government was forced to hide evidence, bully defense witnesses, and deceive the judge and jury in order to save face. Cox was forced to go through a show trial where he was prevented from presenting evidence of his repeated rejection of violent plans, his efforts to leave the country, and the government's violent coercion. Cox then got 26 years instead of pleading to 5, and redacted. Number 20. Diversion from pretrial motions. It's likely that the reason the government was down on their knees begging the defense to take a deal right before the hearing on pretrial motions is that they knew the motions were strong and their case was weak. When Traverso made no effort to negotiate, the government had to come up with something other than the merits of the motions to focus on at the hearing. So they indicted Cox and Barney on conspiracy to murder federal officials, no one knows who, and had the arraignment coincide with the motions hearing. They left the defense's pretrial suppression and dismissal motions totally unrebutted and relied on the judge's reaction to the superseding indictment to dissuade him from granting the motions, which is exactly what the judge did. He obviously wasn't going to grant motions for dismissal and suppression on the small stuff without knowing how that would affect the horrible stuff the defendants had just been indicted on. Once the motions were denied, the government was back to begging deals. They offered Barney's 5 to 7 years on any one felony he wanted. Traverso was MIA by this point, so Cox does not know what they offered him, but it would have been similar. No deals were reached, and the government was forced to trial on charges that had been a bluff. They kept the exculpatory evidence out, prejudiced the jury heavily, and basically got lucky to get the conviction they did. The judge even said that he didn't see a conspiracy and that the defendants may as well have conspired to kill little green men from Mars. But he sent it to the jury anyway. All right, I'll do the rest later. This will be labeled as part 1.